Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Miscoe. I'm a healthcare attorney, and while I apologize that I don't look lawyerly today, I hope you find the information regarding cash practices just as valuable, uh, even though I'm not in a suit and tie. I wanted to begin by discussing what a cash practice truly is. Oftentimes, this term is misconstrued or misapplied. A cash practice or a truly cash practice is one that does not perform any covered services or services that would be defined as covered services by any third party payer. To Medicare, that would be services other than medically necessary manipulation of the spine for correction of a subluxation and associated neuromusculoskeletal condition. For payers like the Blues, Cigna, United, Aetna, that would be manipulation therapy services performed for maintenance rather than restoration. When you completely exit from the covered service realm, you're performing a service that we can code differently, price differently, avoid duplicate fee schedule issues, and also avoid the coverage game. And why that's becoming more and more popular as there are more and more exchange plans where to keep premiums under control, deductibles are rising. Specialty visit copays are rising. For example, I have a what's called a silver plan that has a $3,000 deductible and an $80 specialty visit copay. So to perform medically necessary services for me, there's a significant out-of-pocket expense that I would be subject to, thereby making a cash or non-covered service alternative much more attractive to people like me. Now, some people, they call themselves cash practices. They're out-of-network providers. They don't sign any contracts with any payers in the commercial realm. And they do services, and they either provide the patient a super bill or they submit a bill on the patient's behalf, and maybe they accept, but they don't accept assignment of the claim. And to me, that's not a cash practice, because a cash in that scenario, you may be accepting cash from the patient, but you're still making representations on the patient's behalf as to not only the type of services rendered, but their purpose. So when you submit, uh, uh, give the patient a super bill with CPT codes and diagnosis codes for them to submit on to their carrier, or you do that for them by submitting a non-assigned claim, the carrier is receiving that information and making the presumption that the care meets their definition of medically necessary care, and they're going to make a payment accordingly under the terms of their benefit policy. Now, that as a non-participating provider, I can tell you it is much more difficult to become audited, but there's still some post-payment risk there from a fraud, waste, and abuse perspective, under the premise that you're giving the patient codes, or you're submitting codes that are designed to influence or induce the payer to believe that it's medically necessary care. They're making a payment on that basis, and if they find out later otherwise, your misrepresentation of the services um, uh, could be alleged as a way to bypass the defenses that we apply for non-contracted providers in terms of post-payment audit defense. Now, what's the misrepresentation? What you have to understand is that in the coding system, under the National Transaction and Code Set rules, there are CPT codes and HCPCS codes, Healthcare Common Procedure Coding System, for reporting physician services and supplies. And interestingly enough, let's take a simple visit, let's say a chiropractic manipulation, some electric stim, and mechanical traction. There are CPT codes. Let's say we're doing manipulation of 1 to 2 regions. That's a 98940. Electric stim, supervised CPT 97014, or its HCPCS counterpart, G0283, and mechanical traction, CPT 97012. Now, if we turn to HCPCS under the private payer S codes, we find a code S8990 that represents manipulation or therapy for maintenance rather than restoration. So we can have the exact same service, but it's the purpose or the intended outcome of the service defines whether we code it using the CPT system or the S code system in order to represent to the payer what our purpose of the treatment is. So let's take your weekend warriors, you know, they get aggravated from doing whatever, and you're doing a 1 or 2 visit and done, and they're out. Well, most payers would call that palliative care, wouldn't meet their definition of medically necessary. And their policies, if you were subject to them, would require you to bill that, especially in the blues, using the S code, in which case it wouldn't be covered and it would be denied. But if you reported that service, that same service for that same purpose using the CPT codes, they would probably pay it. And if they determined later that service didn't meet their standards, they're going to want their money back, and whether they get it or not is a subject of a legal argument. Long story short, a true cash practice only renders those services for which third-party payers usually would not pay for. We would code them under the S8990 system, and because there are no fee schedule allowances or whatever for that code, you're pretty much free to adopt whatever fee schedule you want for that service. And that the existence of that code provides an easy conduit for us to describe what could be the exact same physical services, but the change in purpose allows a change in the code and a change in the fee. Now, some of the common pitfalls people make when they try to engage in a cash practice, there are issues of whether they still have active participation agreements. What do you do with Medicare? And those are two separate and distinct issues. For circumstances in the commercial payer world, when you have existing participation agreements that you do not want to terminate, because you want to be able to represent the patients that you're in network, a much longer and deeper conversation would be necessary to describe why, and that might be appropriate. But long story short, under those contracts, if you render a covered service, you have to bill it on the patient's behalf. If you don't render a covered service, as long as you notify the patient in advance, in most cases, and the requirements for that advance notice vary, then you don't have to bill the service, and the patient pays out of pocket in full for those services. For Medicare, it's a little trickier because there's a statutory rule that requires billing for services that are covered by Medicare. While maintenance care is not covered, manipulation is in some circumstances covered. While medical necessity is a statutory exclusion to coverage, the way Medicare interprets it, if the service is ever covered and it's not covered in this circumstance for reasons of medical necessity, you still have an obligation to bill unless the patient directs via an ABN, even though there's no statutory or regulatory authority to give the patient that authority to direct whether you bill it or you don't. Nonetheless, Medicare thinks that they can do that. So you'd avoid your billing option with an ABN option too. Another way to get around billing Medicare is to not perform manipulation and use non-manipulative forms of adjustment. That's a deeper technical discussion as well. But in either case, if the purpose of the care is palliative, preventive, supportive, corrective, maintenance, wellness, it wouldn't be medically necessary anyway. And because you've avoided an obligation to bill, you can internally code that using the S code and charge accordingly, thereby making quote unquote non-covered cash services cost effective for the patient. Services that we don't have that counterpart S code that allows us to change the fee, like evaluation management services, x-rays. There are third-party group programs. One that comes to mind in particular is ChiroHealth USA, and that program becomes an effective way to offer discounts to those services for people who are receiving non-covered services. Now, that is a very quick explanation to what is about a 2-hour discussion. So if you don't understand all of that, don't be flabbergasted. But what the mistake most people make is not understanding the coding documenting the purpose of care correctly, following the Medicare process under the statutory guidance when you want to avoid an obligation to bill Medicare, or following the contractual guidance under your commercial payers in order to properly avoid billing. And then there's also some issues that arise in your state licensure statutes that you need to pay attention to as well. So I don't want you to think that there's a size solution to the quote unquote cash practice, but if you follow the law and understand what the law is that applies to you in your particular locale, then you can effectively implement a cash practice to the extent that you desire to, or at least offer that option to patients, especially those that don't present with conditions that fit into carrier coverage standards, or don't present with the ability to come for care often enough for you to demonstrate that the care will meet their medical necessity requirements. Now, the other interesting thing about a cash practice is that when you're dealing with most third-party payers outside the auto and workers' comp realm, the provider is making the representation as to whether the services are medically necessary or not. In work comp and auto, you're not. Those are statutory reimbursement schemes. Usually there's cost containment regulations. In those cases, you're sending the documentation with the claim. And for that reason, it's left to the payer to determine, one, is the care causally related to the reported injury, and two, whether the services are medically necessary or not. So in that circumstance, in workers' comp and auto, depending on the state and what their rules are, palliative care might be covered, maintenance care might be covered, corrective care might be covered. And it's up to the individual payer to make that determination. And in some states, there's a process that they have to go through to challenge whether the care is actually medically necessary or not. So because you, the doctor, are not making the representation, then the whole S-code concept really doesn't apply to you. You submit it as if it's medically necessary, subject to their determination. So you can still play in the auto and work comp realm and do that type of billing without disturbing or creating any duplicate fee issues with your quote unquote cash practice. That's again about 13 minutes to discuss about a 2-hour topic, and I apologize for the brevity, but if you have questions on this, reach out to your healthcare lawyer or whatever, have them walk you through the law and explain these things to you, because too often people make mistakes in this realm. The sanctions, if you don't bill Medicare when you're supposed to, are very significant. It can be up to $1,000 per claim. Sanctions within commercial payers, it's a breach of contract issue. It usually doesn't result in monetary sanctions. And then, of course, if you mess up and don't follow any of your state licensure rules relative to like prepayment plans and things like that, when you're doing non-covered services, you can get in trouble there as well. So make sure you understand what the rules are. And once you do, then you can figure out an implementation strategy to the extent that you want to do more cash, or at least offer that option to patients like me that have these high deductibles, high specialty copays, where covered care would be much more expensive to the patient. That's all we have time for today. Next week, Kim Clapp is up. Be sure to tune in. I'm sure she'll have some exciting information to share with you. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.